The human mind has a peculiar way of remembering the moments before everything changes, those seemingly insignificant details that, in retrospect, were the first whispers of something wrong. That's how I remember June 5th, 2006. The night that would bleed into a date I'll never forget. 060606. The summer air hung thick that night, carrying with it the weight of an approaching storm that never came. My girlfriend Natasha and I were lying in bed, the soft glow of her bedside lamp casting long shadows across the walls of her apartment. The gentle hum of the city beyond her window had begun to fade, giving way to that peculiar stillness that only exists in the hours after midnight. I was drifting in and out of consciousness when the mattress shifted. Through heavy eyelids, I watched as Natasha rose from the bed with an unnaturally fluid motion. There was something off about her movements. Mechanical, yet graceful, like a marionette guided by invisible strings. No word, no explanation, not even a glance in my direction. Just the soft pad of her bare feet against the carpet and the quiet click of the front door. The silence that followed her departure seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. Minutes stretched into eternities as I paced the apartment, my mind racing through possibilities. Natasha wasn't the type for midnight wanderings. Her Russian Orthodox upbringing, courtesy of her priest father, had instilled in her a certain predictability, a routine that made this behavior all the more unsettling. 30 minutes passed, then 45. The digital clock on the microwave blinked its red numbers mockingly, each minute deepening the pit in my stomach. No cell phone. To call, no way to reach her, just the growing dread that something was terribly wrong. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in, and the shadows in the corners grew deeper, as if they were watching, waiting. When she finally returned, the person who walked through the door was both familiar and strange. Her eyes held a distant look, as if she were gazing at something far beyond the physical world. "Can I have a cigarette?" she asked, her voice carrying an odd timbre I'd never heard before. She didn't smoke, had never smoked in all the time I'd known her, yet here she was, asking with the casualness of a long-time smoker. Outside, beneath the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp, I watched her closely. Her movements were still, still carrying that ethereal quality that made my skin crawl. When I asked where she'd gone, her response sent a chill down my spine. I just walked around the block and stared at the sky. The words themselves were innocent enough, but the way she said them, distant, dreamlike, as if recounting someone else's memory, made my blood run cold. As she spoke, a car passed by, its headlights casting our shadows against the building wall. For a split second, I could have sworn her shadow moved independently of her body, a fraction of a second too late, like an echo in light and darkness. I blinked, and everything was normal again, but the image burned itself into my memory. The night air felt charged with something I couldn't name. My recent reading of the Necronomicon floated through my mind, mixing with the realization that we were crossing the threshold into June 6th, 2006, a date that held weight in both superstition and numerology. The coincidence felt too perfect, too orchestrated, as if something had been set in motion long before this night. Standing there in the artificial glow of the street lamp, watching Natasha take long, practiced drags from a cigarette she shouldn't have known how to smoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something had shifted in the fabric of reality, subtle but profound, like the first hairline crack in a dam before the flood. Little did I know, the true horror of a 60606 was still waiting for us, coiled like a serpent in the darkness of her bedroom, patient and hungry for the perfect moment to strike. The rest of the day passed with an artificial normalcy that felt like the calm before a storm. Every mundane moment seemed charged with potential energy, like the air before lightning strikes. Natasha had returned to her usual self, or at least appeared to, but there were moments, brief flickers when she thought I wasn't looking, where that same otherworldly distance would cross her face, as if she were listening to voices I couldn't hear. As night fell, the city lights began their nightly dance, casting an orange glow through the windows that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. We went through the motions of our bedtime routine, but everything felt slightly off-kilter, like a painting hung just a few degrees askew. The bedroom, with its familiar furniture and photos, felt different somehow, colder, more hostile. The ceiling light cast harsh shadows across the room as we settled into bed. I couldn't stop thinking about Natasha's midnight wandering, about the way her shadow had seemed to move wrong outside. The light above us hummed with an intensity I'd never noticed before, a high-pitched whine that seemed to drill into my skull. Then came the silence. Not the gradual fade of normal quiet, but an absolute absence of sound that pressed against my eardrums like a physical force. In that moment of perfect stillness, I swear, I could hear the air itself holding its breath. The crash came without warning. The light fixture didn't just fall, it exploded downward in a shower of glass and metal, raining destruction across our bodies and the bed. Time seemed to slow as the shards caught the light, creating a brief, beautiful constellation of reflected death before reality crashed back in with the sound of splintering glass. We leaped from the bed, hearts pounding in perfect synchronization, our skin peppered with tiny cuts that stung like angry wasps. The carpet beneath our feet crunched with every step as we surveyed the damage. The fixture hadn't just fallen, it had been ripped from its mounting, the wires twisted and torn as if something had yanked it free with tremendous force. But there had been no sound from above, no impact or disturbance that could explain the violent descent. Just that perfect silence, then destruction. The laws of physics seemed to have taken a holiday, leaving us alone with something that didn't play by the rules of our reality. "We need to get out of here," Natasha whispered, her voice trembling with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Was it fear or recognition? The look in her eyes reminded me of her strange behavior the night before, that same connection to something beyond our understanding. Together, we carefully dragged the mattress into the living room. Our movements, slow and deliberate, as if we were trying not to attract attention from something we couldn't see. Every few seconds, I found myself glancing back at the bedroom doorway, expecting to see. What? I couldn't say, but the darkness beyond seemed to watch us with malevolent interest. The living room felt safer, but only marginally. We positioned the mattress as far from the bedroom door as possible, creating a flimsy barrier of furniture between us and whatever presence seemed to have taken residence in there. The door closed with a soft click that echoed with disturbing finality. We lay there in the dark, neither of us speaking, both straining to hear any sound from the other side of that thin wooden door. The digital clock on the cable box cast its green glow across the room. 11:54 p.m. Still 06:06:06. Still trapped in this nightmare of a date. The silence stretched on, broken only by our carefully controlled breathing and the distant sound of traffic. Then, at exactly midnight, everything changed. It started with a whisper. No, not even that. A suggestion of sound, like the memory of something falling, then another and another. The sounds built upon each other, growing in intensity and violence until there was no mistaking what we were hearing. Objects being thrown with tremendous force, furniture being overturned, glass shattering against walls. The cacophony was contained entirely within the bedroom. each crash and bang crystal clear through the door, yet somehow muffled from the rest of the world. This wasn't the usual noise from upstairs neighbors or the building settling. This was happening mere feet away from us, with an intensity that should have brought the whole building running, yet the night remained undisturbed outside our apartment. 5 seconds, 6 seconds, an eternity compressed into moments as we lay there, paralyzed by terror, listening to what sounded like a tornado tearing through the bedroom. The sounds had a deliberate quality to them, as if whatever was causing them wanted us to hear, wanted us to know it was there. "What the fuck?" Natasha whispered, her words barely audible over the chaos. "What the fuck?" I echoed, our shared disbelief creating a small bubble of sanity in the madness. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pregnant with possibility and terror. We lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, neither of us willing to move, to break the spell of stillness that had descended. Finally, I found the courage, or perhaps the foolishness, to investigate. Every step toward the bedroom door felt like walking through molasses, my body fighting against the very idea of opening it. The doorknob was ice cold under my palm, sending shivers up my arm as I turned it with agonizing slowness. The door swung open to reveal nothing. The bedroom was exactly as we'd left it. Glass shards still scattered across the carpet, the broken light fixture lying where it had fallen. Not a single piece of furniture was out of place. No signs of the violent disturbance we'd both heard so clearly, but something had changed. The air in the room felt different, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. And there, in the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement, or perhaps it was just a shadow, or my mind trying to make sense of the senseless. 7 years have passed since that night, but the terror remains fresh, a wound that refuses to heal. I've told this story many times, always emphasizing its truth, its reality, because the alternative, that I imagined it all, is somehow more frightening than what actually happened. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear phantom crashes and bangs, echoes of that inexplicable violence. And sometimes, when I catch my own reflection in a darkened window, I see that same distant look that Natasha had in her eyes that night, as if something from beyond our reality is still watching, still waiting for another perfect moment to tear through the thin veil that separates our world from whatever lies beyond. The date 06/06/06 has become more than just a number to me. It's a reminder that there are things in this world, or perhaps outside of it, that we can't explain. Forces that operate beyond our understanding of physics and reality. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, they reach out to remind us just how fragile our perception of reality truly is. They say time heals all wounds, but some experiences leave scars that never fade. This is one of them. The night. We heard darkness itself come alive, and the world as I knew it changed forever. After about 20 minutes of lying in silence, we both hear objects in the room being tossed around as if someone is trashing the room. It goes on for about 5 to 6 seconds, which felt like an absolute eternity to hear a stranger smashing shit in your home, and then begin whispering, "What the fuck?" to each other in a panic. We are both frozen with fear. Let me take a moment to emphasize something. There were upstairs neighbors who occasionally made noise, sometimes even a lot of noise. This was not someone in the upstairs apartment. The proximity of this sound, the volume, the clarity. This sound was coming from inside that bedroom, on the other side of a door we were standing right next to. I finally get up the nerve after about 5 minutes to go in and check it out, expecting to see a pack of rats or someone robbing us. Nothing. There is nobody in there. Nothing has been touched. The shards of glass remain. The night was unusually still. The world beyond the hot tub, blanketed in snow, seemed to be held in an eternal hush. The flakes fell lazily from the black sky, their descent almost hypnotic, swarming in thick clusters that blurred the boundaries of the world. Silence wasn't just an absence of sound here. It was a physical weight, pressing down on every inch of the land, muffling everything in its path. Even the stars seemed hidden, as if too afraid to shine. My friend sprawled in the warmth of the water, let the chill of the air sting his skin. His breath vaporized in clouds, disappearing almost as soon as it left his lips. The gentle hum of the central heating unit from inside the house was a distant murmur, lost in the vastness of the wilderness surrounding him. The only other sound was the bubbling of the hot tub's jets, each pulse a reminder of the comfort he had come to expect from this unexpected retreat. His uncle's house, massive and imposing, standing in isolation against the frozen expanse, was only a silhouette against the night. For all its modern amenities, the house never felt quite at ease. The walls seemed to creak under the weight of its loneliness, the land too vast, too empty, stretching on for miles in every direction. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, the house felt less like a home and more like a fortress, something built to guard against the isolation, to keep something in, or maybe something out. He was supposed to be relaxing, to forget about the mess of his life back in England, his recent divorce, the endless loneliness he'd been drowning in since his ex-wife left. But tonight, that peace, that sense of calm, was about to shatter. His eyes, heavy with the warmth and the beer, shifted from the soft glow of the hot tub's lights to the darkness beyond. It was a momentary glance, barely a shift in focus, but when he looked back, something had changed. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A dark shape, perhaps a trick of the light, caught his eye. A faint silhouette against the whiteness of the snow. It moved, or at least he thought it did. His heart skipped a beat. He stared, trying to process the movement, trying to convince himself it was nothing, just the wind shifting the trees, or maybe a deer stumbling through the woods. But no, this was too distinct, too deliberate. The figure, or whatever it was far too still, far too unnatural. The snow around it was undisturbed. No crunching of footsteps, no rustling of branches, just the oppressive quiet that smothered everything else. He squinted, trying to make out more details, but all he could discern was a vague human-shaped form, a thin outline no more than a few hundred feet away. It moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, sliding through the snow like something not quite alive. His gut twisted, instinct shouting at him to move, to get out of the water, but he stayed still. He told himself it was just his imagination, the isolation, playing tricks on him, but it wasn't. The figure was real. "Hello?" He called out, his voice cracking in the heavy stillness. The figure stopped. A chill ran down his spine. The thing, whatever it was, had heard him. It didn't turn, didn't respond, but he could feel it. The silence had deepened, and his blood ran cold as it stood there, unmoving, just beyond the edge of the yard. For what felt like an eternity, the world remained frozen, a standoff between man and whatever that thing was. He couldn't see its face, couldn't hear its breathing, but he could feel its presence, a weight in the air, a suffocating pressure. Then, almost as if in response to his call, the figure moved again. This time, it didn't drift. It walked, a slow, steady pace, one step after another, its form becoming clearer with each inch it covered. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and thin. Its body seemed to flicker in the low light, as though it wasn't fully formed, as though it was constantly shifting like the static on an old TV. My friend's mind raced. His fingers, now trembling, reached for the hot tub's lights. He had to see it, had to know what it was. He flicked the switch, and the bright underwater glow filled the air with an eerie luminescence. In that moment, the figure stopped once more. The air seemed to thicken, and then, without warning, it moved. Toward him, the pace quickened faster now, and the certainty of its intent sent a jolt of fear straight to his core. Panicked, he grabbed an empty beer bottle, throwing it toward the shape with all the strength he could muster. The bottle shattered against the snow, a useless gesture, but it did nothing to stop the figure's advance. It continued, its long limbs moving with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them. My friend reacted instinctively. His bare feet hit the cold deck as he scrambled to escape, launching himself out of the hot tub and onto the frozen wood. He ran for the house, the sliding door just ahead, but he could hear the heavy, echoing thuds of something following, something moving behind him. He reached the door and slammed it shut with such force that the glass rattled in its frame. He slid to the floor, breath ragged, heart pounding. For a moment, he thought he might be safe, but he knew that whatever he had seen was still out there, waiting. He glanced up and his blood ran cold. There, just beyond the door, the thing was standing. Its shadow stretched across the snow, dark and unnatural. It was staring at him. He could feel its gaze, a weight on his chest. He didn't know how long he sat there, frozen in place, but when he finally found the strength to move again, he did so with a purpose. He closed the blinds, shutting out the view, hiding from whatever had come from the darkness. But even as he tried to convince himself it was all in his head, he couldn't escape the sense of something watching, waiting. The feeling was relentless, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, until even the warmth of the house couldn't protect him. The night dragged on, and he spent hours in the silence of the kitchen, waiting for the morning light, desperately trying to block out the memory of what he had seen. But in the quiet of the night, one thought lingered in his mind. What the hell was that thing? The hours in the kitchen dragged on like the passing of an eternity, each minute stretching longer than the last. My friend could barely make sense of the panic that had taken hold of him. He wanted to believe it was all in his head, just the result of a few too many beers, the isolation playing tricks on him, the darkness and snow warping his perception. But deep down, something told him it wasn't that simple. Something told him that what he had seen, it was real. The hot tub was still running. He had left it on in his haste, the jets bubbling away in the cold night air. But even as he heard the hum from the backyard, the sound seemed distant, disconnected from his reality. The kitchen, despite its warmth, felt too close. The cold from the outside pressed in on him, and every tiny creak of the house seemed amplified in his mind. He tried to convince himself that everything was fine. It was just his nerves, the stress of being alone, the weirdness of the night playing tricks on him. He even laughed at himself, a nervous, jittery laugh, as he glanced back toward the sliding door. Maybe he'd just imagined it. Maybe it was nothing more than the reflection of trees in the snow, a play of shadows cast by the storm. But that thought did little to calm his racing heart. An hour passed, then another. He stared at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to overtake him. But it never came. His eyes flicked to the door again. The blinds were drawn, but something about it, the heavy stillness, the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, kept his nerves frayed. Finally, after what felt like forever, he couldn't take it any longer. The impulse to go back outside, to face whatever it was, became overwhelming. Stubbornness, that was his problem. his need to assert control, to prove that fear wouldn't dominate him. And so, he stood up, still shaky from the earlier panic. He approached the window cautiously, one slow step after another. The dim light from the porch illuminated the yard, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. His breath was shallow as he reached for the blinds. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave things be. But he opened the blinds anyway. The soft whir of the chain was the only sound in the room as he pulled them aside. His eyes scanned the yard. Nothing. The figure, the shape, whatever it had been, was gone. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. A moment of relief washed over him. He stepped back from the door, planning to return to the hot tub to bury his fear in the warm water and the cold beer. He grabbed his drink from the counter and moved to the sliding door, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before stepping outside. The snow had accumulated even more, its weight now thick and soft, coating everything in a thick layer of white. He could hear the faint crunch of his own footsteps as he stepped across the porch, the cold air biting at his skin. For a brief moment, everything felt normal again. The familiar sound of snow beneath his boots, the quiet of the night, the warmth of the tub waiting for him. But then, as he reached the hot tub and sat down, something caught his eye. A glimmer of something, no, someone, moving in the shadows just beyond the edge of the trees. He froze. His pulse quickened as his mind raced. He looked around, trying to locate the source of the movement. For a moment there was nothing. No shape, no shadow, just the thick, uninterrupted blanket of white stretching out across the yard. He stared harder. Then he saw it. There, just beyond the snowbank, was the dark shape again. But this time it wasn't moving like before. This time it was still, completely motionless, standing at the edge of the woods, as though waiting. Something inside him snapped. The cold water of the tub couldn't keep the terror at bay any longer. His earlier bravery drained from him, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread that clung to his chest. He turned away, quickly, sharply, and tried to ignore the feeling in his gut, the gnawing certainty that something was wrong, that whatever it was still out there. But as he swung around, his eyes fell to the snow-covered surface of the hot tub, and his stomach lurched. On the edge of the water, his beer bottle sat, untouched, its brown surface glistening in the weak porch light. The bottle was full. He stared at it. He had just placed it on the other side of the tub, hadn't he? He could swear it. The beer he'd opened, the one he'd been sipping just moments before. Yet now, it sat there, unmarked by a single drop. A cold wave of panic swept over him. His mind raced. It didn't make sense. He reached out, grabbed the bottle, and looked again. It wasn't the beer he had been drinking. No, this one had no label. Its glass was smoother, shinier, different. The weight of it in his hand felt wrong. He pulled his eyes away from the bottle and scanned the yard once more. The tracks, the footprints, the ones he had seen earlier, the ones that had been scattered all over the yard, leading up to the hot tub, they were gone. Everything was gone. But he had never imagined them, had he? His heart skipped a beat. Slowly, almost involuntarily, he turned around, back toward the house. The sliding door loomed in front of him, a barrier between him and whatever waited outside. He had to get inside. He had to lock the door. His instincts screamed at him to move, but his feet were frozen to the spot. And then, as if the universe itself decided to play one final cruel joke, he heard something behind him. A sound. Soft, like the rustling of snow being disturbed. The faintest crunch. Of footsteps. But these weren't just any footsteps. These were heavy, slow, purposeful. He spun around, and there it was. That shape. Darker than the snow. shifting in the shadows just at the edge of the yard. It was closer now, much closer than before. For a moment, the world around him felt like it was moving in slow motion. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The shape moved toward him again, just like it had the first time. But this time, there was no mistaking it. It was coming straight for him. And as his eyes locked with its dark, empty form, one thought echoed through his mind. This wasn't a mistake. It was never a mistake. He bolted. His legs moved faster than his brain could comprehend, his feet slipping in the snow as he scrambled toward the door. He reached for the handle, but his fingers fumbled, slick with sweat. And then, just as his hand touched the cool metal, the porch light flickered. For the briefest of moments, the entire world was plunged into darkness. He had no time to react, no time to look over his shoulder to see if the shape had followed him inside, no time for anything. He threw open the door and slammed it shut behind him, his pulse racing as the sound of his own heartbeat drowned out all else. The lock clicked into place, but even that couldn't reassure him. He ran up the stairs too fast, nearly tripping over his own feet. He didn't even bother to shut the blinds this time. The house was too quiet, too still. The silence had returned with a vengeance. He grabbed the nearest remote, cranking the volume on the TV to drown out the noise in his mind. Hours passed. Morning came. The snow had settled, covering the yard in a pristine white blanket. The world was calm again, serene even. But as my friend opened the door to the guest room and looked out over the property, his heart skipped a beat. The tracks were still there, but now there was something new. The hot tub lid was closed, and 2 empty beer bottles lay next to it. Buried under a few inches of fresh snow, that was the moment he knew, no matter what he thought he'd seen, no matter how many times he tried to explain it away, something was watching. And it wasn't done with him yet. The shape, the footprints, the eerie presence in the snow, all of it left more questions than answers. What was that thing? What did it want? And why had it chosen him? Some mysteries, like the wilderness itself, remain unsolved, leaving only fear and lingering doubts in its wake.